Thank you for joining us today for a rent control conversation sponsored by the Zoning and Planning Committee of Denver Inter-Neighborhood Cooperation. We want to first start by saying thank you to Southwest Improvement Council, located in District 3 in Westwood, in the west side of Denver, for hosting us in their gym for our forum today. Rent control has been a topic that's been pretty heated, going all the way back to 1981 here in Colorado. And there's been a big conversation with our large and looming housing crisis. Is that feeding back out there? That seems better. Okay. So we decided to have this conversation today because in the last couple years, there's been bills that have been brought forward at the state capitol that have an impact with rent control and local control for cities like ours to make a decision about what rent control might look like. With that in mind, we're going to be covering a little bit about the previous bills, perhaps what's coming in the future, what we can do here in the city and county of Denver, hopefully having a conversation from a pro and a con side to rent control. So joining me on the stage today, I have Chiriboga-Flor with 9 to 5 Colorado. She is the co-state director for 9 to 5 Colorado, which is a national organization. We have Councilwoman Kniech at large. And we have Amy Duclos speaking in opposition, who is our education chair, but a property owner and has an economics degree, I believe. We're going to take a moment and I'll go down the line and let them introduce themselves for you in the crowd and you on TV.
Hey everyone, my name is Chiriboga-Flor, and yes, I am the co-state director for 9 to 5 Colorado. We're a grassroots member-based organization dedicated to putting women's issues on the agenda locally and on the state level. We've been working on housing for the last 5 years because housing is a women's issue. The majority, well, 2/3 of low-wage workers are women. If you are in a domestic violence situation, it's really hard to move out if you cannot afford it. And also a large portion or majority of people who are being evicted across the country tend to be single women with children. So this is a women's issue, and that's why 9 to 5 cares about this issue.
Good morning, everyone. Kniech, one of your 2 at-large council members. I always thank you for the privilege of representing this city citywide. My history on the issue of housing in some ways mirrors the history of this discussion. When I came to Denver after law school, I worked for 7 years negotiating with developers on behalf of a community coalition that we organized to help include community benefits and economic equity in major redevelopments, and that included affordable housing. At that time, the city only had a policy requiring developers to build affordable housing on the for sale side because of some legal history early in the panel. A court decision known as the Telluride decision. The city was unable to have a policy requiring developers to provide rental housing in new development. So it was up to us as a community to negotiate with developers and advocate for a more robust commitment to affordable rental housing, which is where the greatest need is and has been in our city for some time. I was elected in 2011, and we worked to first make the city's policy on for sale inclusionary work better, and we succeeded. Ordinance revisions that we passed in 2013 and 2014 resulted in more units being built than cash being paid, and calibrated the ordinance to work differently in really expensive areas like downtown compared to surrounding areas. But we were continuing to face greatest need in the rental community, and we didn't have a policy tool for that under Colorado's laws. So we worked to build the city's first dedicated affordable housing fund, and one that fund in its original form was funded with fees by developers, and it was by all developers. So rather than having an ordinance that just required one segment, residential developers who built for sale, to contribute to the affordable housing needs of the city, we now charge a fee on every square foot of new development from commercial developers, for sale developers, rental developers, industrial spaces. If you are building it in the city and you are not a government or a housing, affordable housing related purpose, you will pay a fee. And then we use that fee to build a range of affordability along with your property taxes, along with a marijuana tax, and along with some general fund dollars. So together, that affordable housing fund was built in 2016 and doubled in 2018. We just exceeded $72 million in investment and several thousand units in just the first several years of that fund being in existence. And I'm gonna give you my disclaimer. I forgot my notebook with all my notes and numbers at the office. So I may be on my phone checking numbers from time to time. I'm not checking my email. Or I'm gonna speak in generalities. I won't have as many numbers as I ordinarily like to today. But that brings us today where we do continue, in spite of the state limitations, to be as aggressive and creative as we can, negotiating with developers anytime they are receiving something from city, in addition to just building a single site with no additional city help. If they have city land, we've been successful in getting affordable housing, including rental. If they have city subsidy, if they need vested rights that allow them to be protected from future changes in city ordinances, in many circumstances with many major redevelopments, we have been able to negotiate. And so I'm hopeful that I can answer questions, dispel some myths today, and talk about both the tools that we're trying to use while we have limitations on control or on building new affordable in rental buildings, but as well as the change we need so that we have a fuller toolbox to be able to get even better outcomes for the people of Denver. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Amy Duclos, and as we had established previously, I'm the INC Education Chair. And I'm sitting on this panel in part because I believe sort of at the 11th hour, the person who was originally slated to be here couldn't make it. And I have a kind of a unique background, and there are parts that I'd like to share going pretty far back in time, because I think they're germane to the discussion, and it frames up my perspective and the lens through which I look at things. So my parents got divorced when I was really young. It was a contentious situation. My mom was a teenage mother. I was raised by a single mother in apartments when I was growing up. I worked really hard through school, got an education from public school, went on to earn an economics degree from UCLA, which informs a lot of my perspectives on how things work. So I didn't grow up privileged, look at things through an economic lens. And now my husband and I own 55 rental units. Some are in Denver, but most are in Wheat Ridge and Englewood. So when I'm speaking, I'm coming less from a big picture policy perspective and having knowledge that Robin and Dre might have, and more from growing up poor, econ degree, owner of rental units. And I'm also informed by a whole ton of research I've done over the last few days, brushing off my textbooks, but also getting caught up on where Denver is and economic theory around rent control. Also had the privilege of talking to the Vice President of Government Affairs for a multi-billion-dollar REIT at length yesterday to hear from him and their perspective. So all of this will be integrated into any of the input that I would have in today's panel.
Well, thank you to all the panelists for introducing yourself. And I just want to give us some history for people in the audience that when I was preparing saw some of the original basis around rent control and pricing caps that goes all the way back to World War I. In the end of World War I, people were returning from home, and they ended up having renter shortages in some of the larger cities, in the major cities, in particular in New York City. And this is something that continued on after World War II for the second time. And as these ideas of rent caps were spreading around, there was a group in the 1980s called ALEC, which I was hoping, Dre, you had covered before in a different zoning hearing that you could talk to us a little bit about the history of ALEC and how we got to a place in which rent control was prohibited by local municipalities and local districts.
Yeah, so ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, is a organization that works to create policy across the country. Tends to be very, very conservative. Tends to lean towards privatizing, for example, privatizing prisons, privatizing detention centers, and so they've been backing a lot of the agenda that we're very staunchly opposed to, and in the 1980s, 1970s, and 1990s, a lot of the rent control bans were passed across the country. They did create some of the legislation that other states have. So currently there are about 30 states that have rent control bans that are across the whole state. And so Colorado did pass their rent control ban in 1981. Even though our legislation wasn't copy and pasted from their legislation, this was a really big sort of measure that was happening across the country. So it's not, I don't think it's a coincidence that we were one of the states that were included in that, and so that's why we have this ban today. And we have been working on overturning the ban to give cities the liberty to really pass what laws that they need, whether it is rent control, whether it's inclusionary housing ordinances to address the housing crisis as they see fit. Because right now, a lot of the measures that have been passed are just not sufficient. 87% of new units that have been built in 2018 were luxury units. And so that's not fitting the needs of community, low-income neighborhoods, communities of color across the country. And so that's why we think we need to find other measures to address the issue.
Thank you, Dre. So just some more background for people in the audience. So there are a couple things that maybe come under rent control in this larger conversation about what that word means. In California and in Oregon, they have a concept called universal rent control, which has to do with a percentage increase each year that's legally allowed on a rent. In many cases, it has to do with a consumer price index plus an allowed amount on top of it. There are other large cities that have rent control apartments. So they declare if an apartment was built before a certain era, that it would be a rent control apartment. And that restricts the stock of newer apartments that would be built that way. And that's when we get into this conversation about inclusionary housing. Inclusionary housing being the mandate that you have to build a certain amount of covenant-covered rental units at a percentage of income. Perhaps you can maybe do that with a rent increase on them as well. Robin Kniech just talked to us and touched a little bit on a Telluride case. And when people talk about the Telluride case, it comes back to a Supreme Court decision, Colorado Supreme Court decision from the year 2000, in which the town of Telluride tried to pass inclusionary housing ordinance. They were sued by some developers who didn't believe that that was their responsibility, and it was held by the Colorado Supreme Court in 2000 that inclusionary housing on rental units would fall under this idea of rent control. Is there anything that you think I'm missing that needs to be mentioned there, Robin? So that brings everybody up to date on what the Telluride Amendment is. So I want to touch just a tiny bit on what many people have seen in the news about Oregon. Oregon, what they had passed was that you could no longer raise rent year over year more than 7% plus the consumer index. And it also included some renters' rights issues, including making it harder, the eviction process longer and harder to accomplish. There were a couple others that I wanted to, one in Oakland, which only allows them to increase a certain rate every day, or every year, which is the CPI. If they can hold on to it for a couple years, and they can do an increase all at once in Oakland, but it has to go past a rent board. I'm curious if anyone on the stage is familiar with any other cities that have rental boards, and whether that's been a conversation about something that would have to be set up if you were to pass rent control here.
Well, I think Dre might be an expert on. So terminology can be a little fuzzy. So generally speaking, Oregon would refer to their laws as rent stabilization, because what they are is an across-the-board amount that per unit. When you have that type of ordinance or a law, It doesn't require an individual board to make individual decisions because it's a formula. So if you think about in Oregon, the effectual limit on rent increases there was like 10.1 or 10.2% in the first year. So most rent increases already kind of fell within that category. What might not be protected in that category was something like if I had an older building and I wanted to take it out of circulation and I wanted to renovate it and then rent it for a bunch more, which is why Oregon's law included this additional piece which said if you're going to be sending your tenants away for reasons other than that they broke their lease, you need to pay them relocation assistance, you need to give them more notice. So those type of renovations and rent increases were allowed in Oregon, but only if you really protected and helped some of your tenants who would be displaced. There are many other cities with rent. Berkeley, California comes to mind as one of the rent in the country. And that's because where you...
I think we're just going to...
Okay. In Berkeley, what happens is landlords who have aging buildings or costs like a boiler go to the rent board to make a case for what level of rent increase they need in order to maintain their building, keep up with real estate costs, things like that. So it's more individualized decision making. So in a place like Berkeley, what you have is really two laws in effect at the same time. You have a statewide cap, and it does generally not apply to the newest buildings. I believe it's 15 years in both states. And the reason for that is to just continue to stimulate new growth. You do need more apartments to be built to meet the demands of a growing population. A lot of our population growth in Denver is natural. It is births. We have this myth that and there are people moving here, but we also have natural population growth that occurs. So that's why those laws do not apply to anything built in the last 15 years. And then in Berkeley, they had a pre-existing law from before some of the legal wrangling and state legislation came about. So they have two laws kind of in effect. The rent board only comes into play for the local ordinance. That does not come into play for the state law, is my understanding. So just to kind of clarify. So usually those site-specific decisions where decisions are made for particular units where you cannot increase the rent without permission of the rent board, that's more rent control. And this term rent stabilization is more often used when you have a large percentage that just creates a cap. So, and I don't know that there's consensus on these two terms. So those are my ways of separating them, but there's probably 5 other ways to try to differentiate between them.
Amy, you're a property owner. What goes into a conversation in your head about rent increases, especially when you have major repairs that need to occur? And it seems to me like you wouldn't want to increase rent too much because you don't want to lose tenants that have been good tenants, and you want to keep your cash flows going, and having to go through onboarding a new tenant and exiting of a tenant is costly as well. Can you talk a little bit about what goes into that?
Well, for us, it's a building by building consideration. We had one 7-unit building in Wheat Ridge that was in such a sad state of disrepair that it was full of black mold. There were big holes in the roof, leaky ceilings as a result, plumbing that had gone bad. And one of the units, there was a hole in the floor in the bathroom from water damage that had occurred. We bought this building in 2015 or 16 and ended up spending over $300,000 just on 7 units. It was so far gone. And in a case like that, all the tenants were month to month. They were all paying well below market rents for that particular neighborhood. It's 32nd and Sheridan, basically. And in order to get the building into code compliance and update the electrical and update the plumbing and put on a new roof and do all the things that were required to make it habitable and safe, we had to ask all the tenants to move out because there was a 3-week period where no one would have water in order for us to do the necessary repairs. The building is now up to market rents, and it looks completely different. Today we put in new windows. We're buying buildings where they're so old and so far gone that the windows don't open. I mean, we've seen everything in these. There has to be an economic incentive for a building owner to make these kind of repairs in order to make them safe and help. Does that help?
Just for everyone in the audience, we are passing around note cards. If there's questions that you want asked, you can hand them to Loretta, I think is walking around, and we'll make sure that we try to get to them. So this one is for you, Robin, and it has to do with how does the idea of rent control or rent stabilization, or maybe even both, fit into what's happening with Blueprint Denver and the comp plan and our goals towards actually achieving attainable housing? Is this something that it's just one more tool in the toolbox, or is this something that maybe could replace a tool that we've been using before?
Well, if we're talking, and I'm going to always use the terms separately, I actually think the Supreme Court got it wrong when they said that inclusionary housing was a form of rent control. Rent control was never intended to apply to the setting of prices of new development. It was always intended to affect the increase of prices over time. So I will speak first, I guess, to just pure rent stabilization, which I actually think is probably the conversation we've been having in Colorado. I do believe that it's a tool that has no substitute. There's nothing else that we have that can help to protect those who are already housed from increase in prices that are justified mostly by profit motive. It is important for folks to be able to cover the cost of repairs. It is important for folks to be able to cover the cost of increases in other costs of operation, if that's utilities and things like that. And rent stabilization is designed to cover those costs. But where you see, 30% and 40% rent increases, we have to acknowledge that there is other motives involved, and where there's not a repair involved, it's profit, because the market will bear it. The rules of the market are really strong. If people will pay it, you can charge it. And the housing market is right now unrestrained with that regard. When you see people unwilling to pay the price, or a lack of supply of people looking for housing, that's the only natural market limit. So I believe that it is an important tool for local governments to consider. It will be most relevant in strong markets. If you have us, the last time we had this conversation, we had it at a statewide level. There are markets in Colorado that have dropping population and have a shortage of jobs, and folks are leaving those communities. Those are probably communities that don't need this tool, and that's why it's about local choice. Where communities have the need, it's really important. But I do think that if we want to achieve the city's vision of an equitable and inclusive city that includes folks of all backgrounds, then their ability to stay housed in their community and not be just, providing profit for those who are not just covering costs, then rent control or rent stabilization is a tool that we should be allowed to have. On the inclusionary side, something that can be addressed by itself, the legislature could clarify that local governments have that power separate from the rent stabilization question. That tool, it could substitute for some other things. For example, right now we use federal subsidies to build housing for those earning 60, 70, or even 80% of area median income. Those are folks like entry-level teachers, entry-level police officers might fall into that category, maybe an entry-level nurse who's not specialized might be in that category. These are folks struggling to stay in Denver. To the extent we're using subsidies to help build that housing right now, If we were able to have that housing built in the marketplace, for example, through inclusionary housing, we might be able to target more or all of our federal subsidies or our city subsidies for lower income families. The preschool teacher, the child care provider, the person who draws your blood when you go to the clinic, the person who works at the grocery store when you go there. Every dollar we spend to try to help that workforce housing levels, sometimes it's called, or the 60 to 80% of AMI, that's a dollar we're not spending for the homeless individual who's only living on Social Security. So I do think that having that power might allow us to better target and prioritize our local resources so that we would continue to use the same level of subsidy that the city has, but we would get further with it for the lowest income families while not forgetting the really important teachers and police officers and nurses that we also need to keep housed in the city.
This is one coming from the audience, and I think this is one that perhaps Dre and Amy, you can both touch on. Last year at the state capitol, there was a bill that was brought forward that was intended to remove the preemption, to allow rent control by those and it to be defined. So maybe rent stabilization, maybe inclusionary housing. This is talking about what does the economics say? And I understand that there have been kind of studies on both sides that show rent control has the intended impact and some that doesn't. Perhaps we could start with you, Amy, talking about some of the economics there.
Well, the textbook economic assessment of rent control, and I don't know how many upper division econ classes I took, but was presented in the most basic economics classes as an example of bad policy. Rents rise because there are more people who want to live in an area than there are homes for them. Housing follows the same basic laws of economics as any other goods. When the demand exceeds the supply, prices will rise. If the price is forced to be below market level, people will supply less. The conversation I had yesterday, because I'm not armed with a lot of statistical information that is specific to national trends. I do have information about Denver a little bit. And Robin, please, and Dre, correct me if you think I'm getting this incorrectly, but what I was told yesterday is that over the course of the last 9 years in Denver, that building permits that have been issued have been equivalent to only 37 units for every new 100 residents. Does that sound, you agree with that stat? Okay, this was quoted to me. It was averaged over the life. No, so sit with that for a minute. For every 100 people that have moved to Denver, only 37 new units have been built. So naturally, prices are going to increase. The 40 to 50% rent increases that Robin had mentioned, 30 to 40% rent increases, we've only seen those happen. I've seen those firsthand. I've seen them actually double in a couple of my buildings. But that's because we went through and we gutted the buildings down to the studs. We had to start over. The buildings were in such a state of disrepair. So the other way you can think about this is it humane? Is it fair? Is it right for people to be living in these kinds of conditions? I mean, we've seen feces and mold and, you wouldn't believe some of what we've seen in some of these apartments that we're buying and then renovating. I think the biggest spikes, and I looked this up this morning too, the biggest spikes that we saw in our rents were 15 and 16%, and that was a few years ago. I'm going to say that was in the 4 or 5, 6 years ago time frame. This last rent renewal cycle, we didn't see the big jumps. We were seeing like 2 and 3% rent increases. When I say see, we have our property managers take care of all of the leases. I have 2 kids. I've got I'm pretty busy, and so that portion of our Our portfolio is subbed out, and so in a way, I rely on them to track rental trends. So I can't know what a house in Harvey Park rents for right now. They're my eyes and ears. So in today's Denverite, there was a study that had just been done. It was just published that actually rent growth is trailing the overall rate of inflation right now. Denver rents have only increased 1% year over year, and earnings have actually increased by 3.1% over the last 12 months. So we're in a different trend cycle now than I think we were a few years ago when in terms of these rent spikes that we were seeing.
Those are median rent increases. They don't show you what the rent increases are at the lowest level, where vacancy is lowest and rent increases may be higher. You can't always tell what's happening to your most vulnerable residents by looking at the middle or the average. And I know you have all the study information.
No, I just want to talk about the U.S. Census Bureau from 2017 that says there are 19,452 unoccupied housing units in the city of Denver. So I really question this, we need to build, when there are actually units that are empty. In Aurora, there is a deficit the last time I checked. If you look at the comprehensive plan, of 14,000 units for families getting between $0 and $25,000 a year. There is a surplus of 20,000 units for renters that are making between $25,000 and $75,000 a year. So we can, and currently there's about 4,000 people experiencing homelessness in Denver on any given night. That does not include people who are couch surfing, who are living with other family because they can't afford their own unit. So Denver Homeless Out Loud estimates there's probably about 6,000 people who are homeless. And so we could house those people if those units were available. A very terrible program, in my opinion, that was passed in Denver was the LIVE program, I believe, by Mayor Hancock, that basically subsidize units that are penthouses, the most expensive units in downtown Denver, so that people could live there, but also you're subsidizing thousands of dollars instead of subsidizing $500 units, $800 units, $1,000 units. You're subsidizing $3,000 units for one apartment or one bedroom, where you could actually spend that money more wisely subsidizing cheaper units. And really what you're doing is not creating an incentive to create more affordable housing. You're actually skewing the market so that people continue to build luxury apartments instead of building affordable units. If you're subsidizing luxury apartments, there's no incentive to create affordable housing. So there's a lot of different sides to what's going on, and that's why I don't believe we need to believe in the market. I do not believe that we need to create free or just no restrictions on the way growth happens, especially because it is directly impacting communities of color, it's directly impacting women, and so the people who are being able to take advantage of these programs tend to be wealthy, rich, white families or white people. And so I think there's a lot of different sides into how we motivate growth in the city.
We have a couple of questions here that are about the same issue, and that's whether we have the ability now, or what would it take for us to have rent control on new builds, even these luxury builds, and how long does a covenant last if you were to build a rental that was price restricted? Maybe Robin, you could answer this one.
Yeah, I'll take the second one first, and then we'll go back. Well, the short story is we can't. I guess that's the first question. Can we control rent on any unit in Denver today? No, I cannot. And when I say control rent, I mean control what the initial rent is if you didn't get some agreement with the city, or control what the increases are for the tenant over time. Neither of those are legal today, period. Can't do it. The second question about, so what happens when we do get to restrict a unit. I'll give you an example. We do this all the time. So at the Gates rubber factory site, for example, that developer sought significant assistance from the city in the form of tax increment financing. It was a brownfield. The site had a major cleanup. It was needed to clean it up. It was a threat to health and safety before it was cleaned up. So they sought assistance in the form of, rather than their sales tax and their property tax coming to the city, they're using the sales tax and the property tax for the cleanup of the site, for the infrastructure. In exchange for that, the city negotiated that they will have rental units mixed throughout the site at 60% of AMI, and a portion of those will be available to those who hold vouchers, so they will actually be even lower income. And that's an important thing to remember every time I build a unit for a family that looks like the rent is for 60 or 80% of AMI. It also becomes an opportunity for someone who has a voucher who's even lower income, maybe a homeless veteran. So you can't always tell the income of the household based on just what the unit price is, because if they use a voucher, they could be much lower income, and we could be helping to solve that need at the bottom that I talked about. So the city's starting point used to be that affordability had to be for 20 years if we were involved in a policy or a city subsidy. We recently increased that to 60 years. And that's for your typical project where someone is intentionally building affordable housing. We're giving you money for that housing, and then now you have to keep it affordable for 60 years. Where we are either negotiating with the developer, the second place where we sometimes get units that are mixed in a building is through the density bonus. So the 38th and Blake transit stop, for example, has a building that will be mixed income. It's mostly market rate. Rather than paying their fee, that developer fee I talked about, there's always the option of building on site. And we, as council members, can't require them to do that, but I often encourage it. But where you want additional density around that transit stop, then you have to build your units on site. So a developer chose that option, they built the units on site. You have two choices then. Option one is you do it for the number of years, and then it could be at risk of expiring, and then we have a right of first refusal to buy that building if anything ever happens. We want to keep our affordable units affordable, so we have this right to buy any most affordable units when the building is being sold, so we can try to preserve them. Some folks don't want us to have that right because it can muck up their bank loans and their investment agreements. And we also don't really have the money to buy a mostly market rate building. So it's kind of an empty option, right? I have the right to buy a $50 million building, and I do not have $50 million as a city to buy it. So the option is to make it affordable in perpetuity. If you make it affordable forever, then we will waive the right of first refusal. That is a new arrangement. This density bonus at 38th and Blake is relatively new. The first project that got built under it helped us to figure this out, and now this will be available to projects going forward so that we can have longer affordability. Now we are looking at a study to potentially expand our density bonus to more sites across the city, and this does not violate the law because it's voluntary. I, as a developer, can choose to just build what I have the right for today, and then I have the right to pay the fee, and you can't make me build the unit. But if I choose voluntarily to seek this additional density, then the city has the right to say, because that's voluntary, you then, will have to build on site. So we are doing a study that's going to take about a year and a half to get the economics right, because we do care about those economics, to try to expand that to more transit areas in particular across the city. And one of the things we'll look at in that is what the length of affordability should be as a standard. So we'll look at what the AMI level of those units should be, make sure we have that the best we can. We'll look at the length of affordability again. So the short, I know that was a long answer. I'm not very good at giving you the simple answer because this is really tough stuff, and you've all been very patient to learn about the long answers. But it's a minimum of 20 years. often 60 years, and now we're getting to perpetuity in some cases.
Back to the questions from the audience. There's a whole lot of questions here that have to do with market, and it seems some people in the audience agree with you, Amy. If the problem is building more housing, some of these questions are saying, what's standing in your way from building more housing to actually solve the problem rather than fixing the rents? Also, this one I think is kind of related to this. We'll come back to it.
So if I'm hearing the question right, it is about why am I not building? Is that the question? So I actually don't build, but we've looked into it. And I want to give you a really concrete example at the intersection of basically Alameda and Broadway, and why I stepped away from a project over there. But before I do, what I want to be sure that is noted here is we're talking a lot about luxury apartments and new builds, and I think that those are very visible in the community. The inventory that I have is C and C plus properties that we're turning into B minus and B properties, right? The units that we have, I don't have a single unit that rents for more than $2,000 a month, and the ones that do are single family homes. So most of our stuff is really in the B class property, which I don't know what the strict definition of affordable is. I mean, we use this word so liberally in these conversations, and who defines what is affordable? Does anybody have that definition up here? And I'll pass it on to Robin in a second. But to me, what we're doing I feel like I'm providing affordable housing to people with the model that we have right now. And if a rent control or some sort of rent stabilization goes in, I hope that in these discussions, the little investors like me, aren't being squeezed in ways that really are intended for the REITs that are building A-class luxury apartments, because we're not in that category. So I hope that's kept in mind, because one of the things that could absolutely happen if stabilization or rent control goes into place is I could be dissuaded from doing improvements on my property because there's no return on investment anymore. I can't raise rents in accordance with the market if you put a cap on, okay? But in terms of this A-class property and construction, what I can tell you is we were approached by a broker, apartment broker, to buy 3 buildings that were adjacent to each other, basically at the intersection of Alameda and Broadway. The zoning dictated that we could very easily build 20 units on that dirt, and we would have purchased it for about $1.2 million. As I started looking at the math and started talking to general contractors to do the build, because I'm not a general contractor, I'm not a builder, we do renovations of older buildings. But the condo defects insurance, just that, for what we would have to purchase to be covered for that, was going to be upwards of $70,000 for the duration of the project. When it comes to the permitting process, I've done big enough renovations that I've had to rely on general contractors to use permits and get approvals from the city. We've had permits back up for 2 and 3 weeks at a time because of a clerical error or something that just wasn't included, in the permit. And so there are all these other factors that go into new construction that are prohibitive from a financial and a time perspective that get locked up in the city's processes because they're busy. And so weighing all that out, I'm disinclined to do new builds because it's too painful and expensive. And I don't want to build condos because of the condo defects law. So what's happening also with that is impacting affordable housing in the city as well. And I hope that enters into this discussion as well.
Okay, and do you want me to answer the what is affordable housing question?
Yeah, attainable affordable housing.
Okay, so generally speaking, housing is affordable to your household if you're spending about 30% of your income on that housing. So if you make $100,000 a year, what's affordable to you is going to be different than what's affordable to a household making $25,000 a year. So it's individual to the folks. When we talk about building new affordable housing in the city, generally speaking, we are talking about something that is deed restricted. It means there is a legal covenant that says you can't charge more than this when you sell it or when you rent it. So that's the capital A affordable housing. Generally speaking, for rental, we're talking about 0 to about 80% of area median income. Those folks, and median income, this is one of those things in my notebook, it's usually around the $75,000, $78,000 a year. So you can figure 80% of that is in the $60,000 a year, depending on family size. And then what happens is you can only spend a third of your rent. So a typical affordable rent might be in the $800 range or so for a household with 3 people in the 60% of AMI range. And again, I don't have my numbers in front of me. So thanks. So basically, that's the capital A affordable housing. It's either restricted or there's a deed restriction or covenant on it. What we know is that of poor folks like Dre was talking about, 0 to 25% of $25,000 or $30,000, only 1 out of 4 of those households lives in capital A affordable housing or has some form of rental assistance like a housing choice voucher. You might know of it as Section 8 voucher. Only 1 out of 4 of those households gets help. So where are they? They're living in the Class C apartments. They're living in doubled up situations, or they're paying 50 or 60% of their income each month for rent, which means if their car breaks or their kid gets really sick and they miss work or they lose their job, they're very vulnerable to becoming homeless. So the short story is that we have to care not just about building capital A affordable housing, we need to care about what's happening in the quote-unquote market affordable housing. And there is no policy tool that we have right now that prevents someone from taking that Class C, somewhat affordable, little a affordable market rate building and flipping it to luxury. This has happened particularly in Capitol Hill with older buildings. So that is a concern, because then every time that happens, you're improving the quality, but the price goes up and those folks struggle. So I just, that's the definition. This term attainable housing, I will share, is I think a confusing thing. When folks use it at the state legislature, they're talking about condos for moderate income households. I've heard folks, sometimes say that they prefer it for talking about housing for poor folks. Nobody's using the same definition. I would suggest we don't use that term because the community is using it differently than the business community, the resident, the organizing, the activism community. I say you stick with whether you're talking about restricted affordable housing, and there's a very clear set of definitions for that, and then market affordable. And I see that Amy's wanting to jump in.
Oh yeah, I'd like to jump in here. So I just did some math because I like math. And using that definition of 30% of income, if your household is earning $78,000 a year, 30% divided by 12 is $1,950 a month. Am I doing my math right? Yeah, you're shaking your head. No.
That's 100% of median income. We're not usually building that.
Right, and I understand that. But as I was saying, if I'm taking a C building and making it a B building, even in the models, that I'm providing are far below that in terms of the rents. And so, I do have some concerns. I just want to be sure that when these discussions are happening, that all facets of the rental market and all types of owners are being, carefully considered here. And let's talk about Section 8 for a minute. We bought a Section 8 building, a fourplex in Denver, and it was my first and only experience with Section 8. We don't own any Section 8 housing, and I was completely open to the idea. I thought it was, I'd like to learn more about how this all works. What I can tell you is we had a letter, and I'm going from memory here, but we had a letter from the organization that runs Section 8. Was that HUD, or I'm not sure who?
Denver Housing Authority administers it in Denver.
Denver Housing Authority, okay. And we what felt like a little bit of a threatening letter from them because there was a screen that was missing in one of the bedrooms in the 2-bedroom apartment that was Section 8 housing. And, in the letter, they gave us a list, and it was some smaller repair items, but the screen was, one that was on the list among some others. And that if we didn't attend to the fix, right away, that we were at risk of losing, or our tenant was at risk of losing the subsidy for the rent. And so, and this may be an extreme. I mean, we had just purchased the building. I mean, literally, I think we'd owned it for all of 8 weeks. And so it made me sort of question that, if those are the kind of things that, landlords and owners are told that they have to, repairs that they have to perform in order to continue to ensure their income streams, it just made me question sort of the governmental interference in the transaction between buyer and seller, which is what, a rental agreement is. So.
I just want to point out too, a study when I was doing the research for this with the New York Times found that there's not a single state in the union where you can make minimum wage and have a 2-bedroom apartment and make it under this threshold of 30%. So a single family couldn't have a separate room for their child, and so that's something they talk about. So I've gotten several questions in a row here that have to do with why, with TIF and bonus densities or removing parking requirements, why are we in a position of giving money, this is what many of these said, giving money away to developers to get something that we should be able to make them build in the first place?
Well, if you think about, I'm just going to talk about tax increment finance specifically, which is a little different than metro districts. I know that that's been a topic of conversation. Generally speaking, these sites are the best place for us to put new density. It helps to protect, I think, the character of existing communities. So if you have a hospital that leaves town, I don't want an empty hospital sitting in the middle of our city. That does not benefit residents. We've had people die at closed, factories and closed hospitals because kids go in and they get hurt, they fall down an elevator shaft. So it's not good for our city to have huge, decrepit, dilapidated properties sitting in the middle of our city, especially not when we do have the need for new housing and services. So the question becomes, can they afford to demolish a hospital, which includes taking apart every sink separately because there might have been a mercury thermometer broken in the sink? So you have to environmentally remediate every sink you take out. That's costly. You also have environmental hazards. I mentioned the Gates site. So where you have those exorbitant costs, I think in the case of TIF, you are making something possible that probably wouldn't have been possible otherwise. You're helping to solve some of the shortage of the overall number of housing units the city needs. And make no mistake, middle-income families above what we're talking about today are struggling to stay in our city too. They could afford some reasonable market rate rents, but there are not vacancies that they can find. So that oversupply matters. So I think that's on the TIF side. The question is what you get for it. So for me, you have to get equity. You have to be doing environmental standards. You have to be doing community provided things like, and this is why I support community benefits agreements. Some sites might need a child care center. Some sites might need local job access. So I think it's critical that we, if and when we're using our local dollars, we're getting a lot of outcomes for people who are struggling, and that those benefits help to benefit those that, would otherwise not be benefiting from a market rate development.
I do want to say something about habitability issues. So that was a huge bill that we worked on last year that keeps coming up. And I also do appreciate good landlords. I do. I live in an accessory dwelling unit. So basically, I'm attached to a house, and there's a family that lives in the house, and I live in this kind of weird unit of a bathroom, a bedroom, and a kitchen. And I'm paying $800 a month, which I really appreciate a lot. I'm a single person living alone, and so it works for me. I'm also a minimalist. I'm also working at a nonprofit, so I don't do this for the money, obviously. So I do appreciate landlords that are doing a good job. I am living in kind of a, unique circumstance. And there's also a lot of very rich corporate landlords who are letting their units become dilapidated. So Golden Nugget, if you Google it, there's a lot of articles about this apartment complex. Right now, we're in the process of suing them because they're trying to sue one of our members who decided to break her lease because she didn't have heat for 11 days, the whole unit. Their boiler exploded, and which could have killed somebody if they had been in the same room. They had bed bugs. They had a mouse infestation. It was absolutely horrifying. And still in court, Arapahoe County, who tends to have very conservative judges, that we're still yet to see what is going to happen, even though it is very clear that they were living in uninhabitable units. And this is a big company. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of lawyers, and they're not doing their due diligence. And we passed this law, House Bill 1170, in 2019 to address this issue and hold landlords accountable that are not doing their due diligence. And yes, it does cost money, a lot of money, to revitalize and renovate apartment units, and there are people who are paying $1,200 a month for one bedroom living in uninhabitable conditions. And so I think we have to really look at, there has to be a balance, and we do have a law of habitability that was not very helpful for 10 years. It really didn't not do a good job at holding landlords accountable or giving tenants the right to really take action without hiring a private attorney. And so I do recognize that. I want to acknowledge that I do understand it takes money to renovate, and there are a lot of corporate landlords with a lot of money who are not doing their job, and that's a huge problem. That's why we passed this bill.
So since you're talking about last year where the state passed habitability and warrantability to try to shore up some of the renters' rights that come to this slumlord stuff. Dre, can you just talk to us, maybe Robin too, because I saw you there, talk a little bit about the last session and what was being discussed and maybe some of the politics around there and where they got to the process.
Yeah, so the rent stabilization bill, as we did call it, to overturn the ban, Senate Bill 225, was essentially to overturn the entire ban so that cities can basically implement ordinances that address the issue as they see fit, whether that's through inclusionary housing or rent control. A few other bills that we passed was application fees. So previously there was no cap on application fees. So the maximum amount, the highest amount we found, this was in South Aurora, was $775 for one application fee. And this was a woman who was going from one unit to another unit within the same complex. And they charged her a transfer fee, an administration fee. They already had her on record. They knew she was a good tenant, and they still charged her that amount. And so basically this bill just caps application fees so that landlords can't profit. If they charge an amount and it's not used for processing, they have to give it back. It also caps criminal background checks to 5 years. For us, that is a racial justice issue. Obviously, people of color are targeted much more by police, and so they are banned a lot of times from different housing units because they have a criminal background. And so it's up to 5 years. There's some exemptions around some types of convictions. And then we also passed a mobile home bill. So 9 to 5 is kind of the guru of mobile homes, not accidentally, it was not on purpose that this happened. But basically, this bill creates a dispute resolution program at the state level so that if there are problems, if there are violations that landlords are committing against mobile home owners and residents, they can take it up with the state. And so that program is going to be implemented and active May of this year, which we're really excited about. This is veterans, this is seniors, these are immigrant families that are living in mobile homes. It's one of the last affordable sources of housing in the whole country, and so we really think that's an important part and piece of our housing resource. And then, of course, is we also passed a warranty of habitability bill. One thing that we did see is that we haven't addressed, that we will be addressing in 2020, is around fees. So you might go into an apartment thinking, I'm going to be paying $1,000 a month. And then you might see other fees. So this is one example of a park that we're also in a lawsuit with. They charge for gate attendant, courtesy patrol, landscaping and dog park, snow removal, concierge, gym attendants, electric, gas, special facilities, clubhouse, gate passes, capital cleans, all the flowers and mulch, gate repairs. These are all fees that are charged in some apartments. Real estate fees, we've seen admin fees, we've seen bill preparation fees, literally writing out your bill for every month you're being charged for that. What are you paying in your rent? Why are you paying rent if you have all these fees on top of that? So you think you're going to pay $1,000 a month, you're actually paying $1,300, $1,400 based on all these fees. Trash valet. Has anyone paid trash valet? Okay, I paid that to $50 a month. The dumpster is literally 10 feet away from me. And we pay every month, we have no choice, for someone to pick up the trash and put it in the dumpster that is right down the hall from us. These are predatory fees, and so we will be working on capping those fees. But this also speaks around affordability and really what that means, because you think you're paying one amount, and then you go in and you realize there are a lot more fees on top of that.
I am so glad that Dre listed off the other bills that they achieved, and one additional one, she's got so many, that they extended the period of notice for an eviction. Used to be 3 days, now it's 7 days, yes? 10, help me. All right, this is a problem when you don't bring your notes, all the numbers. So the short story is more chance to help prevent an eviction. I get asked all the time, what are we doing to make developers or rent control, solve the rental affordability crisis in the city? We need these tools. We need them both the ability to stabilize rents as well as the ability to do inclusionary. But I want to make really clear that they're only one small piece of an overall approach to housing affordability. I always talk about it like this, and a lot of what Dre talked about is stabilizing people where they are. The best and most efficient housing policy is one that prevents someone from losing their housing. We have temporary rental assistance and utility assistance that's helping to do that. We have some homeowner repairs for vulnerable homeowners that helps. We now have an eviction defense program that helps with that. But the short story is, step one, keep people in their home. Rent control fits in that bucket, or rent stabilization, because it helps to keep that current unit increase predictable and reasonable. Not at zero, but predictable. Then the second is we need to give people access to existing homes. I can't build my way out of a housing crisis, and so rental assistance or those vouchers, making sure there's not discrimination in housing, helping people with a first month's rent, helping homeowners that are moderate income with a down payment. We have a whole set of strategies that we need to focus on to get people into homes that already exist. Then third is building that capital A affordable housing. And there is only two solutions for that. One is cash, two is community acceptance. We are all here because we care about affordable housing this morning, but when we sometimes go to build housing for those exiting homelessness, when we go to build housing for those who are Safeway clerks and those who are fixed income seniors, we sometimes don't have neighborhoods welcoming that new affordable housing the way that we should and the way that we need to take care of folks who are already in our city and already suffering. Cash is part of it, and we always need more, but so is acceptance and inclusion, right? And then, so those are the three buckets. The last one is overall supply of housing. We will never solve for housing for the lowest income families through new supply. Dre is totally right. That will not happen. But it does matter if we can't keep up with, for some of our middle income families, and here's what's happening in the data. This is really clear. Folks that should be able to afford market rate housing are renting down, maybe because of debt, maybe because of supply, and they then make it more competitive for households that really do need fixed income housing. And so supply matters in the sense of having enough growth in our city to manage our overall population. That's why I mentioned those redevelopment areas. That's the place where we should be concentrating that growth, near transit, and then trying to, at the same time, preserve the character of neighborhoods. But I will give you my case study. My dear friends in Boulder, they tried to restrict all housing growth, and the median home price is $1 million. Restricting growth does not keep your city affordable. Preventing new growth may prevent a new luxury unit, but it doesn't ensure that everything else stays affordable. So all four of those strategies matter. Rent stabilization applies to the first bucket, which is about residents staying in their home. Inclusionary applies to the third bucket, capital A, affordable. Every new inclusionary unit is a new dedicated restricted affordable unit. So those two strategies fit into a big set of buckets, and we have to keep our eye on all of these renter protections, as well as building new housing for those who are homeless. Inclusionary housing will not build units for those who are experiencing homelessness because they need services to go with it. So we will not solve our problem if we pass rent control. We will not solve our problem if we pass inclusionary, but we will help in those two strategies. And that's, kind of hard to say to you. I don't have one solution for you, that I have to keep working on all four. But together, if we keep working on all four, we have already helped 22,000 more households than we did before the housing funding was passed. 22,000. That matters. Doesn't mean we've gotten there. We still have a lot of households struggling. But that shows us that our work matters, and we got to double down on it.
This is a question for you, Amy, that's been coming out of the audience, and we kind of talked about this before. There are stories and documents, and when I was doing my preparation, that it's incentivized people not to move through different types of housing when they get in a rent control apartment, for example. And so in these examples here, somebody gets a 3-bedroom apartment because they have the family, then their kids leave their house, but the price is so much lower, and so then no one's moving out of this, and so the kind of housing stock, the missing middle, these apartments aren't opening up, and so you're getting the luxury that are new that no one's regulating, and you have these older apartments that no one can afford. Can you talk a little about that?
So I watched a lot of Seinfeld in the 90s, and as I recall, there was an episode where George Costanza was combing the obituaries so that he could find people who had passed away, so he could find a rent-controlled apartment in New York City. Yeah, it's wildly inefficient. So my best friend I grew up in Sacramento, and we spent a fair amount of time in San Francisco. I'm about to reference a Stanford study that was recently completed about the long-term effects of rent control in San Francisco. But a personal example is my best friend from high school and her then boyfriend were living in a huge apartment in San Francisco in the Mission District, like 4 bedrooms, 2 living rooms. It was spacious, rent controlled. He was paying $1,600 a month for this space. And we joked with them that they could never move because they had the rent controlled apartment. They also had a significant number of problems in the apartment that the landlord was completely unmotivated to fix, and they were fearful of saying anything to the landlord. There was a fear on their side calling things out to the landlord's attention. They did eventually move to Oakland and spent $500,000 on a teeny tiny house that needed a lot of work. So Oakland's still expensive. And I don't know how many of you have been to San Francisco in the last couple years, but they do have a bit of a homeless problem situation there too, just like a lot of big cities. And they've had rent control for a long time. In 1994, there was a rent control change in San Francisco. It used to be that they had rent control, but it didn't apply to smaller apartment buildings. They're considered mom and pops that couldn't set the market in the way that 100-unit buildings or what have you could. And in 1994, what they saw happening was these smaller multifamily units were being purchased by these huge corporations and the REITs. So guess what? The market was being set. with the smaller units. And again, I'm quoting from a Stanford professor's study of rent control. 1994, they removed the small multifamily exemption. And did tenants choose to remain in their apartments? Well, yes, they did. Just like the inefficient use of the huge space that my friends, that just the couple were living in, it reduces mobility, right? When you put rent control in, because these were people who were living in a big city that were then commuting completely across San Francisco and into Oakland from their rent-controlled apartments. So if you think traffic's bad now, put rent control in place, because then people will start to stay put and travel for their jobs. But in San Francisco, it had a pretty dramatic impact in that it did initially prevent renters from leaving the city as a whole, but landlords also reduced rental supply by 15%. Here's how they did it. They were then encouraged to replace their rent-controlled apartments with high-end units or owner-occupied condos. So it ultimately shrunk the supply. And in fact, this study found that gentrification in San Francisco actually accelerated under rent control long term. So what that means, or what they found, is that it initially provided huge savings, but then there were big losses in the forms of higher rents for tenants who came later. So, you fast forward 10, 15 years, and those rent-controlled apartments from 1994 are now not occupied by the people who originally benefited from the rent control regulations. So, in some cases, yes, but it was the minority. So San Francisco became even more skewed toward upscale housing. Because the landlords started to demolish their old rent-controlled housing, build these new high-end apartments, and so it shifted the mix of residents toward people with more money. So I would hope that as we're considering rent control in Denver, that we're looking carefully again at other cities who have had rent control in place for 20 plus years and learning from the results that they've seen.
I'm just really quick, because I used to be a RTD transit organizer. We have the most expensive transit system in the country right now, which doesn't make any sense. And if we raise the sales tax 0.025%, a tiny bit, we could have free transit. That would help with congestion. I'm just saying.
I just want to touch on two things. One, it's interesting that this idea of a growth limit came up, because it's been an internal conversation about actually hosting another forum just like this about a growth cap, because it's been discussed in the region, and obviously it just passed in Lakewood. I do just want to go back to the assertion that people will just demolish the buildings. In response to them being demolished so that they could go to luxury, there was a bill that was passed in California called SB 330, and what it requires is that they have to replace every single one of those affordable units if they intend to build luxury on top of it.
Okay, so there are some commercial real estate agents that are sitting in the audience right now, and I don't know if you'd be willing to write something down on a 3x5 card and pass it up here, so you have more current information than I do. But there are, I get contacted once a week from somebody who wants to purchase one of our apartment buildings. And every time that happens, I like to ask the agents, well, where's the buyer from? Is this a Denver person? And I can't remember the last Denver person that was interested in one of our properties. The buyers are coming from the Bay Area. So let me say that one more time. The buyers are coming from the Bay Area because the return is so eroded in California now with rent control and with the expense of buying dirt in San Francisco or Los Angeles, that the money's coming here. And so what has also happened is that has driven the prices of apartments up. We have one apartment that the value has gone up over 50% in the last 3 years. I could sell that apartment right now to a San Franciscan that would be happy to get, what I don't consider a great return, but it's still 2 and 3 times what they're seeing for the same amount of investment dollars in San Francisco.
So we just have time for a couple more questions. when we close out, I'm hoping to touch on 2020, but before this one, we got 3 times. It's for you. I think, Robin, you're probably the best one to answer this. Is there any person in an agency in the city that verifies a developer's assertion that they cannot break even without incentives like density bonuses to actually provide affordable housing?
Well, we don't see the books on a typical development because, again, we don't have the legal ability to require them to build affordable. So showing me the books on your single unit, your single parcel 5-story building, I have no reason to see your books. I can't require you to do it even if your books show you can do it. So just to be clear, on a routine development, no. Where we enter into negotiation, it depends. In a tax increment financing situation, generally speaking, the Urban Renewal Authority sees every single line of the books. And they see exactly how much you're paying your investors, they see how much your concrete costs, because you have to make the case that you are unable to afford this development without this assistance because of the environmental issues or because of the demolition or needing to build new roads or new parks. So it just, where there's money involved, most likely people are seeing the books. And then in the middle where we're just, for example, not giving anybody money, but the density bonus, we don't see the books on each project because there's already a formula that's been established. So if you are getting a density bonus, you have to build 5 times what the linkage fee would have required you at 38th and Blake, at the Central Platte Valley, also known as the River Mile, for example, they would have to pay 6 times more. So it doesn't matter what their books show. The ordinance has a set formula in it. The question may be, where did that formula come from? And so what we do is we do something called a feasibility test when we do these. We did them when we set the requirements for the inclusionary housing ordinance just for for-sale properties. And again, almost all of our conversation today and all the law we're talking about is about rental. But on for sale, we did this study, and it is true that at a certain point, you may require so much that the project doesn't happen. And I will share with you that that is a barrier for making some of the changes we've made. There are those in the state legislature who fear that the policies we're asking for are intended just to kill all new development. And if that's the attitude that our communities have, we will have a much tougher time getting our state legislature to give us these tools, because these tools are meant to harness growth, make it turn out the way that you want, but not to kill it. So we do these economic modeling tests to say, well, what if we required 15%? What if we required 20%? What happens? And most developers don't build with their own money. Most developers have to go to an investor and they have to pay them interest or a rate of return to get the money. So it's not just a question, hey, we should just require 50% affordability and developers will just take less profit. Developers won't be able to get the money to build. They won't get it from a bank. They won't get it from an investor. It's not their money. They have some money in the game, but almost always there's an investor. So we test to see what's the point where we can require the most affordability, but there is still the ability to pay for the concrete, pay for the workers, pay the bank back its interest rate, and make it all work. That is what we do, and it doesn't mean that there aren't other standards, right? We all still have city plans. The project has to meet with the conformance with the city plan. If the city plan says this is an area for townhomes and it's a 5-story project, then it's probably not going to be in conformance with the city plan. So there are other things that we look at other than just those numbers. But that's the way we work to try to calibrate it so that we are trying to ensure that it's still possible to build, but you get the most public outcome that you can. It's called a feasibility study.
Okay, so I was jotting some notes down as you were talking, and I appreciate some of the ideas that you have. I am concerned that investment dollars will leave Denver. You had mentioned the expression that policies would potentially kill development, and I think that should be something we should all be concerned about, because we can't. One of the solutions to supply and demand, and as the equilibrium price continues to rise, for rents in the city, is provide more supply. I mean, it really is that straightforward. I guess a show of hands, and I know this is being filmed, so you might not be able to see, but how many of you in this room, through a mutual fund, through your 401k, through whatever investments, do you have or think you have money in a real estate investment trust? That's it? Wow. So maybe not even 20%? Okay. Well, this is what REIT investors look like. And, those REIT dollars chase return. And if there is no guarantee of return in Denver because there is a cap on rents, those REIT dollars are going to find their way elsewhere. So as an owner and as an economist, or at least somebody with an econ degree, my feeling is that the solution would be to provide some form of housing subsidy, the cost of which is borne across, all taxpayers, as opposed to imposing, a specific price regulation or limitation on builders or apartment owners, because I can tell you, I am actually shopping one of my Denver apartments next week for sale. Just knowing that this conversation is so persistent, I'm looking to potentially take my own marbles off the table and go buy something in Boise or Des Moines or somewhere that isn't here. And I can guarantee you other investors will do the same.
I think what you're hitting on is the underwriting incentives. We got a couple of questions here about what kind of things the government offers to lower the cost for developers or rental property owners. Some that I can think of are like the they apply to businesses but not people, but like a PACE program that would help you with energy efficiency and those kinds of things. There's also mention here about why not a public bank and underwriting incentives. I think public banking is probably a bigger conversation. We're hitting our time limit here, and so I'm hoping that, Dre, perhaps you can touch a little bit on what we might be expecting this session since it just kicked off on Wednesday.
Yeah, so in 2020, the legislative session already started. We are running 2 mobile home bills. One is to modernize the Mobile Home Park Act. So there are some protections that are still lacking around evictions and retaliation. So we want to upgrade our current statute. So for example, we want to make sure that homeowners are not being evicted from a park because they were working on their car, and that's a rule in their lease that they broke twice, and now they're losing their home and everything because of this sort of a little bit arbitrary rule. So we're upgrading the whole Park Act to make sure that people are not evicted for those types of reasons, and that if they're evicted, it's for a very good reason. And then also community control is really important. I'm a huge advocate of community land trusts, cooperatives. I think that is better when people collectively own a piece of land or a property. And so this second mobile home bill is an opportunity to purchase. It's a little different from right of first refusal, but basically when a park is up for sale, making sure that residents have the first right to purchase and have some time to actually collectively raise the money to purchase a mobile home park. More and more they're closing down, and they're being bought out by these huge corporate landlords that tend to be very predatory. And so we want to make sure it stays in community control and stays affordable. Like I said, this is seniors, veterans, these are people of color, immigrant communities that are living in these parks. And they're all over Colorado. If you don't know of a mobile home park, now you will. You will see them everywhere. When you drive into the mountains, they're absolutely everywhere. And so those are really 2 big bills that we're leading, and the other one has to do with fees. So I'm not going to give too much detail on that, but like I said, rental fee or different fees that are attached to your rent tend to be, sometimes they are predatory, sometimes they're excessive, also late fees. We have a member who paid $3,000, almost $3,000 in late fees alone after 8 months. If you cannot pay your rent, and that's why you're late on rent, chances are you cannot pay a late fee on top of that. And so those are some of the bills that we will be leading in 2020. Is this
is there anything coming with
For rent, yeah. So rent stabilization, we will not be running that bill, unfortunately, this year. The sponsors didn't want to run the same bill that we did last year, which was a little disappointing and not the choice of 9 to 5. We would have run that bill, so we might see something different than last year. But I just want to say in general that we do have a values problem in this country around housing. Housing is considered a luxury. It is not considered a basic human right. If bagels all of a sudden cost $150 for a bagel, you will stop getting bagels. You will probably get some other sort of bread. That is not the case with housing. If housing prices go up, you can't just say, you know what, I'm not going to use housing anymore. That's just not what I'm going to do. That's not how it works. I have seen people do everything they can to pay for rent, even if that means not buying their medicine, not eating 3 meals a day, not sending their kids to after-school programs that cost money. There's so many things that people are sacrificing right now to pay rent, and that's a problem. And this is fundamentally a problem in the United States, that housing is not considered a basic human right, and it has to be. And that is what we have to do to change the system, is also think about our culture and the way we think about housing.
Okay. I know I'm closing here, but I want just to respond. You said somebody who got evicted because their car was parked somewhere. They were fixing it. They're fixing their car and it was prohibited. Well, I mean, like I feel like we've been pretty lucky, and our management company has done a good job in selecting tenants who, honor the lease that they put in place. We've only evicted people if they don't pay their rent. So, I mean, I don't know all the technicalities, but if it was part of the lease that they wouldn't fix their car on the property and they're now getting evicted because they're breaking their lease, they're the ones breaking the contract. I mean, I think we have to look back at the agreement between, the buyer and the seller and respecting that. But in closing, I guess I am concerned that imposing some form of rent control, some kind of stabilization, might have the opposite of the intended effect. Everything I've been reading about rent control, and frankly, in my own experience and how we would react as real estate investors, I'm just concerned that it will mean that investment dollars will leave the city. I'm concerned that supply will shrink. I might look at turning some of our rental units into condos, possibly. We'll look into that as a possibility. And all roads basically lead to a shrink of supply, which then lead to higher prices, higher rents. So, and it's borne out in San Francisco and in New York and in Los Angeles. And I don't know why Denver would be any different, unless whatever is happening is different than what those other cities have done, and still provide a return and a profit incentive for the investors. I don't know that it's the answer.
Well, I want to thank everyone for a really civil, respectful conversation about a really important topic. Some of us may be here because this is impacting us in our daily life, and it's personal, and it is critical that we have a place we can rent, that we can afford. Others of us may be here because we believe that we stayed in a diverse city, and we want to have neighbors of different ages and races and incomes, and that we think that's an important value. Some of us may be here because economically we understand that our city can't run if the workers who serve those bagels, who work in schools similar to the building we're in today, if they can't live in our city, our economy won't work. Other people won't be able to make the money they need because they won't have the workforce they need. So regardless of whether it's personal, economic, or values-based, this issue of access to housing affects all of us, and I do think we all need to stay at the table. I think that it is hard to say to a community that if you have reasonable expectations and we have policy tools that are matched to those, that will make progress. It doesn't sound like a presidential slogan of like, here's a simple solution, But that is what we have in the city. We've helped 22,000 households stay stable, avoid homelessness, get out of homelessness, avoid eviction, afford housing so they can buy medicine, stay in the same school year round. We can do that, but we know the need is closer to 100,000 residents. So we have to keep at the table step by step. And I hope that if the next conversation we have is about these density bonuses and inclusionary approach around high transit, high redevelopment areas, I hope our community will be at the table talking about how we can get it done rather than coming up with, simple answers that say, well, we don't want any more growth because we don't want any change, and therefore then there's no new housing and no new affordable. That path won't get us, it'll get us to the bolder outcome of $1 million median home price, and that's not what any of us want. So let's talk about how we do it, and let's talk about the other values we need to protect, right? Which is renter protections in addition to the prices. So we'll be continuing the conversation with the state legislature about whether they can give us more tools on the inclusionary side. We will be continuing the conversation at the city level about some of the renter protections we're allowed to take on. There's a bunch we're not. We can't touch much of the eviction process, but we can talk about maybe relocation assistance. So we'll keep talking at both levels, state and city. And I hope that you'll stay at the table with the how-to, and then remember that none of our residents who are in need will get their needs met if our communities don't welcome a diversity of residents near us in all of our neighborhoods. All of our neighborhoods need to be welcoming to those who are struggling, especially as we're in winter and we're going to have a conversation about homelessness. Our residents leaving homelessness, we have an important housing model that works. 85% of those folks stay housed. But our communities are not welcoming that housing at the level we need to build 10 to 15 new buildings for those exiting homelessness in the next few years. So we're not on this panel up here, but we all are on this solution path. Thanks.
I just want to say, if your contract is not in your primary language, then how are you supposed to follow it? That was the situation with this person. The contract was in English. The landlord knew that the majority of the residents were Spanish speakers and didn't bother to translate it.
Well, I just want to say at home, thanks to everybody. We weren't able to get to all of our questions, but please know that you can see this video, and we're going to try to get more of these questions answered at denverinc.org. This panel today and this video were brought to you today by Neighborhoods. Denver Inter-Neighborhood Cooperation is made up by roughly 100 registered neighborhood associations. If you're not involved in your neighborhood association, you can head on over to denvergov.org/RNO. We know that neighborhoods work better when neighbors work together, and we invite you to come to any one of the meetings that we have on a regular basis. We have an education committee, we have a transportation committee, we have a parks and recreation and open space committee. We have a zoning and planning committee, which I am the co-chair of, and we have a sustainability committee. There's so many issues to work on, and we just invite you to join your RNO and join INC. Again, my name is Ian Thomas Tafoya. Thank you.